Hey guys, Adam here, Bearded Talk Podcast. So, kind of a tough episode coming your way, but a much needed episode. And I'll try not to speak too much because I want to let our guests speak and I want to let the data speak. Though we know advertisements, no calls for anything that helps me in any way for this particular episode. This episode is a very serious episode and needs to be treated with the utmost respect and gentleness and lack of critique, if you will. And I'm not even going to edit out that just because we want this to be as real as possible. Today we are talking about sexual assault and harassment in the creative industry. We will be using a portion of the Rising Tide Society and Honeybook's results of their sexual harassment and assault survey that they took later 2017. I'll be discussing with Rising Tide Society's community manager, Kait, who is an incredible woman. She's a great person. She is the community support manager for Rising Tide Society, and I can think of nobody better to go through these results from the survey with her. All of the resources, including the survey, the results, the inspiring blog posts that she'll speak about, all of those are in the show notes right now. You can link those up. She also speaks about a book that helps people counteract sexual assault and harassment and what to do in those situations to prevent during and after those occurrences. That is also linked in the show notes. It's not an affiliate link or anything like that. Today, we're just being super gentle. So I invite you in to this podcast because I think I was enlightened, and I know that we want to talk about these things. And I know that there are people who listen to this podcast who had no place to go and no place to talk to anybody about this. And so hopefully this can be a starting place for you. But without any further ado, here's my conversation with Kait and I and discussing the results. Thanks. Kait, how's it going?
Good. Thanks so much for having me, Adam.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you on. And it's kind of a weird topic, but obviously something that I wanted to do my best to see if we can, shine some more light on the situation. And it's obviously been a big concern this year in the media and everywhere else. And so, can you explain a little bit more just about what you do at Rising Tide and then kind of what we'll be talking about today?
Yeah, of course. So I am our community support manager. I started out, a lot of you guys know me from the Facebook group. I was our head of moderation, and I have been doing this for a little over a year now. So I'm in a lot of the day-to-day conversations going on online in the Rising Tide Facebook community, but also the conversations that are coming back to us from our local chapters. We have about 430 chapters across the globe. So I help out our members and our leaders there as well. And, we're talking about sexual harassment. It can feel like a beast of a topic. It can make some people feel really uncomfortable. It brings up some really hard memories for others. And so, with all that was going on in 2017, it was constantly in the headlines. We continue to see these conversations pop up in various different avenues in our community, asking questions about, how to handle sexual harassment. But really that indicated to us, we actually don't have a lot of information about how creatives and small business owners, people who are self-employed, how do they handle sexual harassment? They don't have the traditional HR department to go to. Are there any numbers out there or any data out there that actually records and can give a better understanding of just how pervasive it is in creative industries? So that was really, what brought this survey on. And then also in October, we wrote a blog post addressing sexual harassment in wedding industries in response to the Me Too campaign. And it became in 8 weeks our most viewed blog post ever of 2017. So that really indicated to us, this is a topic our community is hungry for more conversation about, and they need more information.
Totally.
So, yeah, hopefully that encompasses the topic.
Yeah, no, I love that. And for the for the 4.5 people that don't know what Rising Tide Society is, I'll just say the number. We have how many members now? Like how many people in the Facebook group at least?
Just shy of 75,000.
Right. And so there's bound to just be a situation for everything, not just sexual harassment or assault, but all kinds of things that people are going to be bonded together by so many things more than their creative endeavors. It's about our lives outside of those things. And so it's not like we were surveying just a few people. There was a lot of people. Do you know for how many people took the survey?
So our sample size was just over 1,000, which statistically speaking is enough for us to be able to draw conclusions and apply it to our broader population. It would be amazing if we got 75,000 people to respond. But the reality is with surveys, it's usually a smaller sample size, but we were very surprised at how quickly those numbers added up. We only had the survey open for a few days in December, which is like the crazy busiest time of year. Everyone is trying to get their stuff done. So we're really, really grateful for it's like just shy of 1,100 who, logged in and shared their story with us.
That's incredible. Now, Rising Tide Society isn't just about sexual harassment or sexual assault per se. Like, what would you say that Rising Tide Society's like main goal is, and can you tell a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so we're, I'm going to sound repetitive. We're a society of creative entrepreneurs. So from hobbyist to seasoned expert, we span over 40 different creative industries. And it came about because being a solopreneur is lonely. You work a lot on your own. If you have clients, you're seeing them, but you don't have coworkers. And it was really born out of the necessity to have community so we can grow together and do a better job at growing our businesses. Our main focus really is business education, business advice, business resources. But what keeps people coming back really is the relationships that they've built with their local chapters, with members they've met online, knowing that they're not in it alone and they have someone to reach out to when they need advice or they just, need someone to tell them that they're doing a good job. Like, hang in there, you can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. That's awesome. It's for anybody who hasn't, there is an episode from Natalie Frank, who founded Rising Tide, and you can listen to that as well for more history about it. Yeah, no, that's totally. I love Rising Tide Society. At first, I was kind of like, I don't know, and especially the wedding industry and just in general, it felt like it was primarily female based, and so that was kind of like just a little bit nerve wracking as a guy. But as far as over the past 2 years, I felt very welcomed, and a lot of Rising Tide Society members have been guests on this podcast, and we've had a lot of good conversations. So, yeah. So tell me a little bit more. So you had the blog post come out, and that got tons of traffic, and so it was even more of a kind of like, all right, guys, maybe we should do something and talk about this. What was kind of the planning and I would say like the thought process behind starting this particular survey? How did you choose which questions you were going to ask? Because it has to be tough, right? Like that's got to be a little bit scary. And how did you decide what questions or what the survey was going to be presented like?
It was definitely a team effort. So it wasn't all on me. Like, thank you so much to the Rising Tide and Honeybook teams for helping me and helping our community with this. So shout out to the team. But we really wanted to have questions that would help us be able to focus and analyze data. I know that does not sound exciting at all, but some key points for us were understanding some basic demographics. So age group, industry type. Industry type was actually the only required question that we had. So we could look beyond just the wedding industry because we had a hunch that this was going on in more than just the wedding and events industry. So we were looking at some basic demographics, what gender do you identify as, things like that. And then we really just wanted to understand how far the reach of sexual harassment had in terms of proximity. So has anyone experienced it directly? If they have, how many times? have they ever witnessed sexual harassment while on the job? If so, how many times? Or if they have not witnessed or experienced it. So we were talking specifically about if someone experienced sexual harassment while on a job, like their current project, not when they were back in corporate life, if they were, working a 9 to 5, but specifically what it's like for freelancers, the gig economy, creative small business owners. So that was the framework, like the overall starting point. And then we just got more and more specific so we could better understand, exactly what's going on. We wanted to know if people experienced it, did they report it? If they reported it, what was the reaction? How were they treated? How was it handled? If they experienced it, did it change how they did business in the future? So we were really just trying to get a better understanding of the different nuances of what it's like for someone to experience sexual harassment, the impact it has on them, the impact it has on the greater community, earning power even. So I guess like what it all boils down to is there just really has not been any like collection of this data before, specifically for creatives who own their own businesses, because creatives don't have the traditional HR department to go to, which granted, HR departments have their own issues. We all know that from, past experiences, I'm sure. But because of that, there was no central collection of this information. If someone did choose to report it, they may have reported it to their client or to the authorities, depending on how severe the situation was. But there was no way for us before a survey like this to actually gather all those different separate instances to be able to say, this is a huge issue right now. It's huge.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a tangent.
No. I mean, we talked about this before. Like, I want to let you chat.
Okay.
And I only know, a fraction of this, and honestly, we've talked about before is I haven't experienced a lot of this. When I first started in weddings, and I'll only share my story personally because it's mine and I want to be open about it. But nothing. I never thought that I had something kind of like a traumatic experience or a horror story, or honestly, it was hard for me to determine what was even appropriate or inappropriate. But like me and another photographer, we would shoot weddings together when we first started. And like, I don't know if it was the kind of weddings we were shooting or just the kind of drinks that people were having, or I don't know, but like people would grab us in different ways and at receptions and stuff like that. And I'd always kind of be like, whoa, but we would kind of like reconvene and be like, bro, like what's happening? And but for the most part, we'd feel like moderately okay, or we felt like we could run away or something like that, or like walk away from the situation at least. And one, that's a luxury in and of itself. I'm finding that we can even walk away from that particular situation. But then I also had a second photographer for me who was like pulled by her hair and kissed, and this kind of crazy situation. And I honestly, I just had no idea. And kind of like we talked about, like with the HR departments, even if you had an HR department, it's like, hey, one of our clients' guests did this to us. Well, that's not even an employee of ours. Like, how do we go about that? And so I think this survey is like a good starting place, and the data from the survey is a good starting place to kind of like get us into there. So no, you can totally share as much as you want. Question for you, just to, and like I said, this is mostly for people who don't know much about this, or we kind of want to just lay out the groundwork here, is what is the difference between, harassment and assault? Yeah, I know it's like a big question, but like, what would you define it as, and what would Rising Tide maybe say?
Yeah, it's actually really important because a lot of times it does get lumped in together, and there are some areas of like gray overlap. And even if you read like Time Magazine's People of the Year, the Silence Breakers, they're focusing on sexual harassment, but there are definitely stories of sexual assault in there as well. Specifically for our survey, We actually had a definition at the start of the survey so that respondents could understand what we were asking about. So for us, we were saying, based on, a common definition of sexual harassment, unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. So, for example, physical intimidation, not letting someone leave, standing in front of them, that incredibly close proximity. And harassment doesn't have to be like sexual in nature. It can also include like offensive remarks about a person's sex. So I think that's why it's hard for us sometimes to grasp just like what we've witnessed, if it's been part of that, because sexual harassment actually encompasses a lot more that so many of us write off as, well, this is just what it's like. This is just what it's like being a woman in business, or this is just what it's like when you work weddings and events and you're around drunk guests. This is just, this is just part of the territory. And so I think that definition was helpful for us to be able to actually kind of lay some clear boundaries out of, this is actually, that behavior is actually problematic. And sexual assault definitely gets tied into the conversation. And I'll be honest, there were some really tough things to read. We had a free response section, and there were people who disclosed sexual assault in that free response for the first time ever. And like, it makes me emotional to even talk about it, being the person who was digging through all that data, knowing that someone trusted us with that information, and just barely having barely an understanding of emotionally and physically what they've been carrying. So obviously they are different, but they get tied into this narrative together a lot because there are some areas of overlap, especially with groping, with someone trying to suggest, a sexual encounter, and sometimes the sexual harassment leading to an assault later on. Not every case is like that, but there were some instances disclosed. So, it's definitely a heavy topic. I know it can be really uncomfortable for some people to dig into that, but it's, I think it's something we have to do. We have to know what we mean by what we're asking and saying.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not the headline.
Yeah, totally. There's a lot more, there's people behind those headlines, and there's people behind this data, like you said. And, like, I can't imagine how tough that is. And I wonder, like, in reality, that Rising Tide survey could be somebody's first time even telling somebody about these situations, and that's even crazier to me. And, for the folks, I probably used to be the kind of person that was like, oh, well, that's just the way it is. And that's the way the industry is. And what I've learned is that that's really easy for a large white guy to say that. There are a few things that trouble people who look like me or are built like me. And, not that I'm a bodybuilder. I have a body like a cartoon, more like Kirby. And so it's, and even if it has always been that way, I think, like, especially our generation, and it doesn't mean that it's right. There's so many things that are not good in society, or that we want to make better and could be better. And it's like, all right, well, we're going to be as vocal as possible, even more, like just turning up the volume as much as possible and moving the needle as much as possible. And, I think that's really valuable no matter what. Like, what's right is right. And I think that's super important. So let's dive a little bit into the survey. And, we don't have too much to chat about, but just what trends were found? Like, what was one key thing that you learned that maybe surprised you, or that was just kind of shocking, if you will?
Yeah. So there are a couple key data points from the survey that I think are really important to highlight, because like we've talked about, there really hasn't been a report specifically on creative industries. We know a little bit more about the national workplace, workforce averages of sexual harassment and whether or not people report it. Specifically from our survey, we found that 54% of self-employed creatives have been harassed at least once. So basically like 1 in every 2 have experienced it on the job at least once. And that's not including creatives who have witnessed a vendor, like a fellow vendor, or been, at a gallery opening and witnessed somebody else on the job being harassed. So that's a really big number. It's higher than the national workforce average, which is about 48%.
Wow.
So it's on par, but it's definitely higher. So it confirmed some of our suspicions. We thought it was pretty pervasive, just knowing what some of these conversations were, but it's hard to use a Facebook post or repetitive Facebook post as proof that this is something going on. And I'll definitely acknowledge, like, okay, so that's half of people in this, broad community. The other half, they may not have experienced it, but we still have to acknowledge that, 50%, 54% of the people that we are in community with, this is like a very real reality for them. This is like part of their story. This is their experience. And we need to acknowledge it, because 83% of people who took this survey said that they never reported the sexual harassment to anyone, period.
Yeah.
And that, that's a problem.
Right.
And I don't blame them. And I definitely want to put that out there. I feel like that's really important. The national average of what they think is like not reporting sexual harassment, as in it wasn't reported to a client, it wasn't reported to a superior, it's about 70%. So again, it's higher. And we're not surprised in a gig economy when you're working contract by contract, you're working with a lot of different people. A lot of times these instances happen.
Yeah.
And they just have to keep working. And, there's fear that there will be retaliation. There's fear that people won't believe them, fear that it will ruin their reputation, fear that they won't get paid if it happened in the middle of a job or a project. So, I definitely think it's worth acknowledging that, I think it's really easy and simplistic to say, well, people should just report it more. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess to tie on to that, when it was reported to the authorities or someone else, 51% of the time, no action was taken. So that definitely reinforces the idea that someone has to handle this by themselves. So, sorry, I feel like this is a heavy conversation. Some of these
this is why we're having it. I think it's like, so even if we think about the happy parts of the Bearded Tog, if you will, or even Rising Tide Society, is running a business and chasing your dreams and your goals. And there are people that have stopped chasing their dreams and stopped chasing their goals because these things have happened, or there are people who are chasing their dreams and this is happening. And so like we need this, like we need this content, and we need this conversation to be had. Just to, like, 2 years ago, I would have felt even more awkward having this conversation. But like, if this can be a more open topic and we can, shine a light on it, like it's going to be a heavy one, obviously, but that's okay. It's totally fine. Okay. I think it's crazy. Like 54% of self-employed creatives have been harassed at least once. Like, that's one of those things, right, where the sample size, out of 75,000 members, but the sample size being around 1,100 or so, like, we can assume that number is going to be a little bit higher, like, and even, like, I wonder, what is the stat of, like, I'm sure, like, Pew Research or Gallup polls have this, but there's got to be a stat of just people who are reluctant to answer fully on kind of intense topics like this, and maybe that even holds it back. You know what I'm saying? Like, I wonder if everybody answered, and if everybody was fully honest, just even, I don't think the survey would look better, if you will. You know what I'm saying? Like, Oh,
for sure. We did a couple things to try and make sure this was as safe of an environment to be vulnerable as possible. The survey was 100% anonymous. We did not collect any information that would allow us to get in contact with the person who responded, which was part of the reason why reading those free responses was even more heartbreaking, knowing that I actually could not follow up with any of these anonymous respondents. But it's, I'm sure there are people who it was just too painful for them to answer it. They were not in a place where they felt like they could revisit those memories. And then, some people who they just, like you said, they just couldn't get to that level of vulnerability or honesty in a survey. And that's definitely, when you're handling a topic like this, that's definitely something to take into consideration. I am all about sharing your story as you feel able to. And I would never want to pressure someone into disclosing information that they are not ready to share yet.
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
No, it makes sense with some of the folks who have run for Congress or Senate seats, and how their accusers have, or not accusers, but people who, their victims essentially, have come out years after the situation because they felt like it was the right thing for them to do, and it was the right time for them to do that. But a lot of people see those things as political convenience. And it's if this didn't happen, if this person didn't run for office, and then this is kind of a larger scale, but it's because I live in DC, we're going to talk about politics a little bit. If that situation, if that person, if they're oh man, this is just tough to say. If the person, so we're talking about Roy Moore. So if Roy Moore wasn't running for a position of power or a higher position of power, I doubt his victims would have even come forward, but there's this, they, like you said, they might not have had a convenient time for them to even come forward, or they may have tried once a long time ago. And that's one of the hard things I think for me to understand, that it's taken a lot of time, is that there's no, outside of the law, there shouldn't be, somebody has to be ready to tell their story, and I've learned that, the second photographer that worked for me and she was assaulted, she told me the next day, which I even was well, just, I'm proud of you for being able to talk about this so soon. And, that's, yeah, I don't know. That's one of those things that kind of bugs me when people are oh, well, why didn't they come forward? And like you said, 58, 83%, don't report it. But then when they do report it to authorities, over half of them, no action was taken. And it's just I can't imagine how, there's probably a smarter word for the word stuck, but that's, you just, yeah, I can't imagine.
It's definitely, I guess, complicated. And, that's why we feel like this is starting the conversation. We want to have, some ways for victims, sexual assault, sexual harassment victims, to feel that they're not alone and that we're listening and we believe them when they do disclose instances of this happening on the job during projects. And also just knowing that this is just the first step for a lot of I'll say this, respondents were primarily women. You already mentioned that Rising Tide is very heavily female based. But there were even men who responded to the survey and indicated instances of sexual harassment. So I want to acknowledge that for sure.
Yeah.
There are a lot of men and women who, starting the conversation, the point that we're at now, is a huge deal that has even gotten to this point. But we also want to continue to take the step forward to say, we're going to do a better job. Those of us who are advocates and allies, and your community members and friends, we're going to do a better job of believing you, of advocating for you, of trying to change this behavior and this culture, within this community. And we're also going to try to take steps, actionable steps, to make those changes. So it's a tall task, and we definitely have a long way to go. But, there are some things that we can do. And one of them, which is, this is the perfect example of it. You said, this is a slightly uncomfortable conversation for you. You feel maybe like a fish out of water being, who you are talking about sexual harassment. But if people like you aren't having these conversations, we're doing a disservice to our entire community, So I think this is so important. And I am definitely like passionating, if that's a word. This is something I care deeply about. I'm someone who like feels very deeply about a lot of things. I'm an artist, I'm a painter, and I think that means I'm pretty sensitive to the world around me. And I just care so much about this community, and I want to do a better job of taking care of the people around me. So that's why I care a lot about this, and that's why I'm here.
Totally. I love that. And it's so great to hear you like passionating, if you will, new vocabulary on the Bearded Talk. It's honestly, it's for me and for this particular podcast, and even for Rising Tide, is for entrepreneurs and creatives in our own spaces. There is just there's no comprehensive, there's like no standards and practices, if you will. There's no SOP. There's no like, oh, we have a situation. Well, let's go pull out the Creative Entrepreneur's Guide to the Handbook of the subject. And we're slowly, and because we're all entrepreneurs, a lot of it's very fragmented. And, somebody might have something that's a valuable resource, and not necessarily on this topic, but about, finances, right? Or like we have a pricing guide and how to price yourself. And, but like the goal, Rising Tide and Bearded Talk for me is I want this to be kind of a place where somebody's like, oh, and I know these topics are not the same at all, but, somebody could say, oh, I want to grow my Instagram this year for 2018. Like, it'd be really great. How could I do that? Oh, there's an episode for that. Let's chat about that. But then at the same time, if there's a situation that they run into in their business, I don't want them to feel like they don't have a place to look or to start even. And hopefully this podcast, like we talked about, when, like it's just the beginning. And at least for me, it's all about just shining a light on dark places. Like people ignore things they don't know. People don't understand things that they don't know. And for me, that's kind of been my driver, is just kind of like, all right, well, let's look into this, and gently and, cautiously and selflessly, like, let's kind of embrace this, if you will, and hear more about it. Just a few more questions about the survey, just for people listening. Can you indicate how divided the jobs were, the occupations, if you were? Like, I like somebody who works for a catering company, they have 40 people on their staff or something like that. Whereas a wedding photographer, it's 2 people or something like that. What did you find any trends in that area as far as like occupation goes?
Yes. So unsurprisingly, photography and event planning were among the top industries, but there were some surprises. Graphic design, marketing and PR, branding, writing, music, visual art. So yeah, there's definitely a wide range of industries. The report that we're putting out on the 25th will have more of a breakdown of specific information like that, but it's a lot more pervasive in different industries than what a lot of times makes like our own community headlines. We talk a lot about it in the event space, but it's happening to all sorts of creatives, not just people who are working with large crowds of possibly inebriated people. So that's definitely something to note. I think we make an assumption that it's mostly there, and it is there very prevalently. But there are a lot of other creatives experiencing it in very different work environments than that. That's
so like surprising to me, and it just shows more to my ignorance, if you will, of like a graphic designer. Like I don't even have any idea other than, I don't even want to speculate, but that's so crazy. So let's talk about what's hopeful
Yes.
in this. Like one, you guys are releasing, by the time this episode comes out, it'll be released, I believe.
Yes.
So you're releasing the survey, the results, kind of a position paper, if you will, or some data. That's correct, right?
Yes. So so by the time you guys are listening to this, you'll have probably read a letter from me that is coming out before we release the report, just from a personal side, explaining why this was really important to us. covering some of the stuff we already talked about today. The data report is coming out. So that's going to be very straightforward. A lot of just key data points, key takeaways with some action items. So that way creatives can use that as a point of reference to be able to continue this conversation. We have some other action type items coming up. So as a lot of you guys know, if you're listening, Rising Tide and Honeybook are part of the same family. And so one of the key takeaways for Honeybook on the CRM side, so like business management, they are going to now be including a safe working environment clause in all of their pre-made contracts that come preloaded as a template in the software. So Paige Hulse, who gave us like a very specific events-based clause back in October. If you go back to that blog post, you can find it. She worked with Honeybook to craft a very general clause that would work for any industry. So thank you so much, Paige, for doing that. That gave us great hope to know that in the very least we could start providing some more tangible resources. And something that I think is important is to know that there are a lot of people doing work on a broader scale for empowering those of us who've experienced it, those of us who have witnessed it, to know how to respond in those situations. So Martha Langdon, her book, Back Off, How to Confront and Stop Sexual Harassment and Harassers, is an incredible resource. So that's, another hopeful thing. There are some resources out there, and I think, starting this conversation is the first step. If you want to add, a safe work environment clause to your contract, that is one way to, protect yourself if it comes to a situation where you have to leave a project because of it, to be able to still recoup your pay if that becomes an issue. So those are some hopeful things up on the horizon that are already out there that you can start implementing, to try and change this.
Totally. What is something, if anything, what can somebody do now if it's if something's already happened? If they've shared their story in the survey, like even if you don't know what they could do, like what advice would you give? Like for me, this whole episode just makes me want to like have a GoFundMe for a lawyer that's going to start investigating these claims and bring people to justice, if you will. Like that's where my mind goes, and I know that it's not always that easy, and it's not always that it should never be that quick, if you will. Like what can somebody do kind of post situation, if you will?
I think that being willing to share with others is really important. It doesn't have to be public. I think that there are a lot of like new business owners, especially people who are just getting into owning their own business, who don't really know that these things can be on the horizon. So when you're in community, if you're in a mentoring relationship with a younger, new professional, if you feel comfortable sharing your story, you will help empower others to be able to know what to do in that situation, to know that they have support in you if it ever, statistically speaking, if and when it happens, to someone, you are more than likely to know somebody else who will go through it or has gone through it. And the biggest thing is knowing that you're not alone, and also just trying to be as open as possible to knowing that sometimes people just can't, like we said, they just can't share, they can't get that vulnerable. But if you're willing to share your story, that will allow them to maybe let that guard down a little bit more, revisit what happened, and be able to take steps depending on the severity of it, especially if it's sexual assault or something that they can go to the authorities on, report it for the first time, to be able to take steps, legal steps. So you never know like what your story can do to help others. Even if it doesn't get to that point of reporting it, you can actually help others, even just by simply opening up yourself just like a tiny smidgen of a bit. You can help somebody else not feel so alone.
Totally. That's going to be another vocab word, a tiny smidgen of a bit.
I'm just full of them today.
Yeah, passionating and tiny smidgen of a bit. Those are like our only happy times in this podcast. So, Kait, thank you so much for just like sharing so much, obviously, and being comfortable with you, mostly just you chatting and listening to my silly dumb questions.
They're not dumb questions at all, I promise.
I appreciate that. I always want to just kind of like clarify and have good definitions, and sometimes those things are evolving, but I think this was a great just starting place for me and for a lot of people that don't understand the situation and don't understand that this is happening all the time. And it's the numbers, like we said, they're probably conservative, and they're still shocking. And I think for me and for you and Rising Tide, the point is that if it was just one person, we would still do this. Like, we would be still upset and we would still try to raise awareness, if you will. These stats represent people and they represent stories, and I don't know, we need to fight for them. That's kind of like where my mindset comes from. Thank you so much. Where can people find more resources just about this particular survey, kind of dive into all the information? And then honestly, is there anybody that somebody can email, or can people still fill out just the survey just to be open with anybody?
For sure. So all of our resources are hosted on honeybook.com/rising tide. So that's where the data report is. That's where the open letter is. You can also find our blog post from October on sexual harassment in the wedding industry, which has the safe working environment clause in it. It has information on Martha Langdon's book, and some other like what you can do, like offering steps to protect and prepare yourself. So definitely, check that out. And I want to make sure that I'm here as a resource for our communities. So you can always reach out to me at Kait, Kait, at risingtidesociety.com. If you feel like you need to share some information with somebody, know that it's done in confidence. And you can definitely reach out to me if you feel like you need to share with someone.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll link the blog post and everything kind of in the show notes too. So people in your podcast player, I know it might be hard to figure out, but find the show notes, and all of these, including the book, are linked. And thanks so much, Kait. And hopefully next time when we have you on, we'll talk about a different subject. But if we have to, we could talk about this again.
Thanks so much, Adam.
As mentioned before, this episode was intense, obviously, but Kait is wonderful, and I'm so thankful that Rising Tide Society, has welcomed me in as a member. It's super cool. I think you should join. There's a link in the show notes because, guys, there's more to life than just what we do. Like, there's chasing our dreams, but a lot of this stuff happens to people, and as we talked about, and in our previous episodes with racism and prejudice in the creative industry, like, it's bound to happen. And so we have to talk about those things, and that's part of chasing your dream and part of trying to do this. And not that it should be, not that it's okay, but I don't want to not talk about it, if you will. Thanks to Kait for coming on and sharing. Thanks for Rising Tide Society and Honeybook for letting us do this episode that I want people to listen to, but not for the plays, if you know what I'm saying. Like, it's not about the numbers here, other than the data, and that data represents people. So everything is linked in the show notes. That's where I would suggest that you go. And if there's anything you need, definitely email me or Kait. And I'm not the best person to talk to about these things, but if you want to be heard, know that I read every email that I get. If anything, I can pass it along to Kait and the Rising Tide Society team. So thank you so much for listening.